All right, everyone, good morning. Welcome to today's webinar Wednesday for the 12th of June 2019. Today we'll be looking at the Hackitt Review and lessons we've learned from CDM Regulations. I'm Jack. I'll be moderating the webinar today, and you can interact today through questions in the chat, which will be answered at the end, and you can also catch up later on YouTube and tweet about it using hashtag CABECPD. Your presenter today is Bobby Chakravarthy, past president of ABS and a fellow of CABE. He's equity partner and head of architecture at Arcus Consulting and has 14 years of experience in the built environment sector across many different disciplines, so we're sure he'll deliver an excellent webinar today. I'll just pass over to him and we'll get underway.
Good morning, everyone. I hope everybody can hear me. We had some IT glitches as usual. Everything happens and starts with IT glitch, whatever we do these days. I tried everything yesterday and all of a sudden today morning when I woke up, nothing worked. So here we go. Some last minute makeup, and hopefully you can all see me. I'm using my iPad instead of my laptop. So you will see a bit of a forthcoming screen in the bottom. So I hope you don't mind with that. Good morning, anyone. I think this is when CABE asked me to do a webinar about Hackitt Review. I was thinking, hang on, I should look at it from a different perspective over here and see what, because the regulations, we are talking about regulations at the moment, and we haven't really got there yet. We're out with consultation at the moment, and we're wondering what happened with CDM regs, of which I'm a big part of. I'll come back to what my background is and why I'm talking about this in a minute, and how we can perhaps learn some lessons from the CDM regs in its drafting, in its consultation, in its implementation, and generally what impact it has to the industry. And they're very, very similar, because if you look at that safety, health and safety, I mean, this new regulations that Judith Hackitt is proposing is pretty much all to do with health and safety, albeit it's with a particular issue of fire. So with that in note, I would like to tell everyone a bit about myself. I'm Bobby Chakravarthy. I think some of you know me, some of you might not. I'm an architect by background. I've started in the industry nearly 16 years back. I'm currently one of the 3 equity partners at Arcus Consulting. We're a national and international consultancy. We have about 200 staff in UK and about 8 offices. I'm also the past president of Association for Project Safety. Association for Project Safety basically is a membership body which looks at health and safety in construction. I'm also a fellow of Chartered Association of Building Engineers. I've also co-founded .be, which looks at bringing young people from different backgrounds, not particularly from construction, but from technology and computer science and geography, and attract them into construction through various ways. I'm also co-founded originally and mentor now Statwick, which looks at supply chain failures in global vaccine supply chain failures. So we are working at the moment with a couple of them. One is UNICEF to try and see how we can reduce the failures in supply chain of vaccines globally. I can talk about that forever and ever if somebody is interested. Just about APS, we are very similar. I mean, a lot of you might not know about APS, but we're a professional body very similar to CABE. We have about 6,000 members, and you can see on the right-hand side the breakdown of our membership. They come from a pretty much wider breadth of construction industry: civil engineers, architects, building surveyors, CDM advisors, construction health and safety specialists, principal designers, and the rest of them are multiple variety of professions like project management, structural engineers, architectural technologies. So you name it, we have it from the construction industry. I think the simple single goal that binds us together in all of this is safety, health and safety in construction. All our members, some of them do it as primary career and some of them do it as secondary career, and all of them single-handedly look at health and safety in construction. Our single aim is to make sure that everybody who works in construction and everybody uses our buildings in the long term are healthy and are secure and safe. That's about APS. Just going back to this webinar, why are we here? It's all because of this event, Grenfell, that has happened 2 years from now. Time passes very quickly. There's also been some recent fires in London as well, and we are still at the point of consultation. It's in a way it's shameful because it has taken such a long time to get to this point. But then if you look at regulations and how they are done and the process that government has to approach, there is quite a bit of system in place through which we need to follow. And unfortunately, it takes time. And regulation, no matter what regulation you want to bring in, it takes time because somebody has to think about it. Somebody needs to write something about it, and somebody needs to government needs to go out and consult about it, and then they need to publish it, and they need to scrutinize it over a period of time. So regulation always has that lag period and for things to happen. But I think when we're talking about this particular subject, I think I would like to take a step back and look at a series of things. First of all, we'll look at what regulation itself means. And second of all, we will look at what type of regulations that are there and what impact they have, and what is that, how did that happen on the CDM Regs, and what are the lessons learned from CDM Regs to Hackitt Review or any new fire regs that are about to come about. So if you look at the simple basic question of what a regulation is, I mean, it's simple as it's defined. It seeks to make improvements by changing individual or organizational behavior in a way to generate positive impacts in terms of solving societal and economical problems. So regulation is pretty much nothing but at a basic level, it's there to change the behavior of individual or organizations. And if it is implemented, it leads to behavior of individuals or entities targeted, which ultimately leads to change. And the secondary element of it is outcomes, basically. So any underlying problem or other changes in the world, it's the outcomes. If there is a problem, how do you change it, and what's the outcome of that change? So basically, if you break it down into two simple things, it's behavior and it's outcomes. That's all it is. It's nothing else to do with anything else. A lot of times people say, oh, it's gonna change the world completely, but in reality, it's not. It's a step-by-step process. And if you look back at the history of any regulations, there is always that set process which the regulation follows, not just in our country, but globally. And regulation, most of the time, has a very positive impact on the society. Sometimes the impact is very slow. It becomes very difficult to measure what the real impact is. But sometimes the impact is pretty fast as well. So if you keep that in mind, that there are pretty much two types of regulation in this country, particularly in UK. The regulations are pretty much divided into two different types, and the types can be simplified into a regulation which is process-based, which is basically reviewing, improving, and then sustaining. And then there is the other type of regulations, which is basically innovation-led regulation. Now, if you look at the process type of regulations, I think I can say pretty much most of the construction regulations that are in place currently, which includes the building regs or health and safety regs, any of them, they all fall pretty much into the process side of the regulation because they're all driven by a particular process. It all says you need to do these and these things as a bare minimum to have positive outcomes. Whereas if you look at the innovation side of it, I think that there aren't that many real regulations which are based on innovations. I think one of probably the best example is the FCA regulation and the sandbox that they have created, financial sandbox. If you look at that, what they have done is this, like construction regulation, they set rules and guidelines as to what you need to do, But then on top of that, they said, we need to drive this. So they put aside a fund and then said, look, if you want to generate innovative products to drive this regulation in a positive way, here's a sum of money that you can tap into. And believe me or not, in last 6 years since it has been set up, something like 80% of the ideas that have been generated out of Sandbox have gone on to produce a very positive impact into the Financial Regulation Authority. So it's not just purely a process-driven regulation. It's not saying here's the process, deliver it, and eventually you'll see the outcomes. It's saying here's the process, but here's a pot of money which you can use to deliver some innovation and speed up the whole process of benefits or outcomes. So there's two ways of looking at it. So chemical regulations, again, for those of you who know a bit about chemical regulations, work in a very similar way. They do not have pot, but there is a very large amount of encouragement for innovation within the chemical industry. So those are generally, broadly, the two ways a regulation is managed, or there are two types of regulation in this country. If you look at its impact in terms of timeline, there are multiple steps. Like I said, regulation always takes time, and there are multiple steps by the time you come to the outcomes, ultimate outcomes, at the right-hand side of the screen to where the initial regulation starts. It starts with policy, with interest, with consultation, and then if you look at the center one, behavioral change, that's where the change happens. That's where they're trying to change the behavior. And then once that behavior is changed, whether it's individual or institutional, you get the outcomes. But then the outcomes are not completely defined by a single objective. For example, let's take an example of environmental regs. I mean, we might have all sorts of environmental rules. Let's say we won't use plastic, we'll reduce our carbon emissions, we'll do all sorts of good things, but we are a very small country globally because environment is all to do with global impact. We are a very small country, but if bigger countries like China or America or India don't play a ball, the impact that we would have, as much as we would apply 100% regulation, the global impact of that regulation will be very minute. So you need to really understand the regulation as much as it has outcomes, but often you can't really define the outcomes because you might have external factors and other influences which may define what those outcomes are. Construction regulations are more simplified because it's something which we have a greater control on, because what happens within our own sites, it's what happens within the design of any buildings in this country. So there are a lot more less influential outsiders in terms of the outcomes, but generally regulations have multiple outcomes and they are influenced by various different actors and various different things that are happening regionally, nationally, as well as globally. So if you to simplify all these different levels of regulation or different elements of a regulation in the process, like I said before, it will all come down to these three items. It's the activities. The activities is basically everything about why the regulation is needed, who are the right people to implement the regulation, who are the people to enforce the regulations, also looking at what other regulations that are there and how can it create an impact. And then once the regulation is implemented, it will be all down to the behavioral change of the individual or the corporate entity that the regulation is trying to make. So that is a very important factor as well, because you can do brilliant regulation, but it doesn't have that behavioral change, whether through a person or an entity, then the outcomes will be completely different, or there will be no outcomes at all. So that behavioral change, as much as it's only one item, is the most significant item within the regulation. And that is the biggest time factor as well. And the outcomes, which are on the right, are completely based on how long it will take for the behavioral change to happen. So the regulation is there, the behavioral change need to happen, then you will have the outcomes, good or bad. And it will all entirely depend on behavioral change. And that's us as an industry. That's where we pretty much sit. We sometimes don't have a greater influence on the outcomes, and sometimes we don't have a greater influence on the regulation itself, on the drafting of it. Yes, you can go through consultation, you can put in your own consultation, but if you look at an impact, I think that's where, when we do apply that regulation and take an interpretation of it and try to apply that, make and try and create change within our behavior, within our industry, that's when the outcomes are, and the outcomes are entirely dependent on that behavioral change. Now, by this time, you're thinking it's Wednesday morning and 8 o'clock, 8:17, and you're thinking, what the hell am I listening to? Why am I listening to all this regulation and the jargon that's associated with it? But I think it was a quick wrap, because it's very important to understand how the regulations are done and what are the influential outcomes, and how it's generally managed and how it comes to being. So that's the boring stuff of it, academic stuff of it. But let's look at some practicalities, the CDM, and we'll try and focus, just keeping with the theme of the activities, why the regulation happens, what the behaviors are, and what the outcomes are. So I think we will focus on that to try and see how the CDM regulations, the health and safety in construction regulations, came into being, what were the behavioral outcomes and behavioral changes, and what were the outcomes. So let's look at a quick historical reference to it. I mean, it all started with basically the CDM regs as it is today, all started with the Health and Safety at Work Act. I'm sure many of you would be aware of it. It was a primary legislation, and it was an act of parliament, and it gives appropriate minister the power to enact secondary legislation. So that's almost the godfather of all the health and safety regulations in this country, in UK. And it's basically everything else that came out on health and safety banner falls one way or the other within the Health and Safety at Work Act. It's made up of statutory instruments, often referred to as regulations, whether it's CDM regulations or asbestos regulations. They all fall under the same Health and Safety at Work Act. It also established what we now know as HSE, the Health and Safety Executive. Basically, it's an enforcement. It's a body of enforcement, which they said here's the act of parliament, but we need to create a body to enforce that particular legislation or any regulations that come out of it. So one of the main, I think this is the most important thing, often people don't really understand. One of the underpinning principles of the act was a movement from prescriptive approach to health and safety regime of risk management, whereby employers were required to identify hazards and assess the likely impacts with a view of minimizing the associated risks. So it was all about, if you look at the outcomes, it was all about process basically, and the behavioral change. So they're saying you need to change your behavior to identify hazards and the impacts that it will have in a way of reducing the risks. So that's all it is about. It's about behavioral change, but it's prescriptive. Like I said before, it's a process-driven regulation. It says you need to do these and these things for you to comply with the regulations, or they say you need to do a minimum of these things to comply with the regulation. Following on from that Health and Safety Act, there were secondary legislations in health and safety in 1990s. There were, I don't know, those who are from 1990s would remember them as the six-pack. It was pretty much a direct response to EU directives and to bring our regulations in line with EU regulations, basically. And there were management regs. Most of you would know about that. Health and safety display screen regs, or manual handling, personal protective PPE equipment, workplace health and safety regs. All of you will have that yellow orange poster in your office. So all of these secondary regulations basically came out of that single act of parliament, which is Health and Safety at Work Act. So all of these secondary regulations obviously cover a variety and range of subjects, but the approach is similar for each one of them, and they're simply based on the principles of prevention. When you speak to a health and safety guy, they always talk about the principles of prevention. It's basically a hierarchy, it's a triangle where you say, in a first instance, avoid where possible, you should try and do absolute effort to avoid a hazard or a problem. If you can't avoid it, then evaluate the risk with that asset. And then you need the third thing is you need to either address it at source or adopt working methods to minimize its effect on individuals or on the society. So the simple regulatory aspect of it is to avoid it in the first place. If you can't avoid it, manage it. I think that's what it is. It pretty much says, and pretty much all the regulations related to this are based simply on those simple principles. It's the triangle, it's the risk design risk management triangle, that's what we call. And one of the other regulations, which is quite important regulations in construction today, is the CDM Regs, which is the secondary regulation. CDM Regs was first introduced in 1994. They were called the CONDAM at that point in time. For those of you who know that, it was not CDM coordinator, but they were different regulations when they came originally out in 1994, and they improved them over a period of time. Basically, they were reviewed in 2004 in the first instance, and then they were reviewed in 2007, and the most recent one it has been enacted in 2015. One of the biggest differences between 2007 and 2015 regulations was that they got rid of the CDM coordinator role and merged the responsibilities of that with the designer under principal designer role. So the directive basically includes the following wording. It is important because the persons, or collectively the entity responsible for coordination on the site, shall ensure that employers and self-employed persons apply general prevention principles. You know, the three preventions I talked about before: avoid, and then manage, and then mitigate. So those are the three principles of prevention. So it's all about those principal preventions. And then shall also organize, cooperate between employers in the matter of health and safety, and check that the working procedures are being implemented correctly, as well as ensure that no unauthorized person enter the site. So it's all about safety in construction. Whether you do it during the design stage, you think about safety. Whether you do it in the construction stage, you think about safety. And when you hand it over, it's about safety in the management. So it's a whole life cycle of the construction process, from inception to basically demolition at the end. So CDM regulations covers pretty much all aspects of it. If you think about Hackitt's review, the golden thread, that's pretty much what it is about. Basically, it is looking right from the beginning to the end. So there is a very large amount of commonality in terms of CDM regs. Those of you who had an opportunity to try and have a look at the document which came out for consultation, it has very clearly prescribed duty holders within the regulation, whether it's principal designer, principal contractor, client, and they pretty much mirror exactly as it is under the CDM regs. To be honest, I think most of the people who have been working with Judith Hackitt on this, or some of the key people from HSC, were helping to draft the initial consultation and everything else. So you can see where the influence has been. So that's where the CDM regs came from. It came from that Act of Parliament in 1974, and loads of secondary regulations and CDM regulations started in 1994, basically, and deals with design risk management in construction. Now, let's look at the outcomes in terms of behavioral outcomes. This is quite interesting statistics, because if you look at the regulation itself, it looks at a cycle 10 years before and 10 years after, basically. If you think that the regulation came in at 1994, and it looks at from 1985, what were the statistics? If you look at the middle long horizontal graph, 1985, the number of deaths in construction were at about 126 per year. And if you look at the trend up to the CDM regs were implemented, it's 83 basically. So it has quite significantly reduced. It's reduced by about 40 roughly. And then it went from death per 100,000 workers 8.6 to 5.1%. And post CDM implementation, if you think at 1994-95 when the CDM regs came into place, and look at the 10 years following on from that, from 1995 to 2004, where they revised the regulation. So the deaths went from 79 to 69. So not quite significant. If you look at the before, it has dropped by about 40, and if you look at the after 10 years, it's only dropped by 10. Now you would start asking questions, did the regulation really have any impact? In fact, it has actually slowed down the number of deaths, the rate from basically 5.1 to 3.5 basically. So it's not had a major impact in terms of number of casualties on site or major injuries. So I think that's something to bear in mind. I think I'll come back to that. It is quite important because this is a quite fundamental fact when we are looking at any regulations. And I'll come to that in a bit, why it is quite significant and influential. Now, if you look at the current outcomes, these are pretty recent as a couple of months back. Outcome fatalities currently in construction. This has got nothing to do with any other industry. We are purely talking about construction industry. If you look at the previous, in 2004, if you can remember, we were about 69 people were killed on construction sites and activities related to construction. As of today, in 2019, nearly 15 years after, we are at about 38, and that figure 38 has been plus or minus 3, 4 for last 7, 8 years consistently. So it has dropped to about 40, and it has pretty much hovered and stagnated. If you look at the graph over time from say about 1981 to 2018 currently, if you look at the bottom part, the right hand part of the graph from 2.9, it has kind of very much stabilized as to how the rate of injuries or serious fatalities have stabilized in the construction industry. If you look at the other industries, they started much lower, but they have reduced quite significantly as well. So in some ways, we are better than some of the other industries, but we are worse than some of the other industries. Some other industries are doing much better than we are. Some are doing really much worse than we are. If you compare with the other industries, on the right hand side, construction, we are at 1.64. Agriculture, they kill 8 people per every 100,000 workers. Water supply sewage about 5. Transport and storage 0.96. Manufacturing 0.52. So you can see the biggest one culprit still is the agriculture. They are one of the biggest people, but that graph is slightly misleading because the amount of workers in agriculture compared to the amount of workers in construction is much higher. So this is talking about per 100,000 workers. So in general, agriculture doesn't have so many people, so they have less people working on it. But even though the fatalities might be less, their rate will be much higher, whichever way you look at it. And if you look at the rate of injuries, it will tell you 38 in construction, 29 in agriculture, 15 in manufacture. So construction is still by far one of the biggest culprits of accidents in this country. There is nobody else who kills more people than construction industry. So that's something to really bear in mind. And if you look at the more recent focus of ill health, again, CDM regs, 82,000 workers last year suffered from work-related ill health. And this is a long-standing ill health, not something which is you get flu for a few days and you're off at work. This is something very serious injuries where people can't go back to work, whether it's musculoskeletal disorders like lifting equipment and injuring your back. Stress and depression has been quite big, and it's been on a significant rise quite recently, and multiple other factors. Asbestos is still the biggest killer when it comes to health issues. Silica, dust is one of the big issues. Solar radiation is the second biggest killer in construction when it comes to health. So all those things do matter. And if you look at change over time from 2001 to 2017, over roughly about 19 years of time, the rate of ill health has not been massively reduced. We are still consistently causing ill health to people in construction. That hasn't made a significant impact at all. There are some secondary regulations which has brought down the impact on the significant factors like asbestos and silica and all those things. But still, if we look at occupational lungs disease, in the bottom left, construction still has a very big impact compared to all the other industries put together. So if you look at construction, it's 3,500, and the entire other industries, about 4,500 occupational cancer. So we are still one of the biggest industries for occupational cancer. People who work in the construction industries are affected by its activities for occupational cancer more than any other industries. So all the other industries put together are at 4,500, and construction industry alone has registered 3,500. So it is quite significant. Again, rate per 100 workers on the right-hand side, you can see construction is still a very big problem. And this is reality today. This is not something in the past, in 1980s or 2000 or anything. This is the reality today. And if you look at the number of people, count them if you can, that many people will die because of health issues every week in construction. And that's the reality today. And no matter what people say, we made massive change. Yes, we did. But we have still a long way to go within construction in terms of its impact. So let me get this straight at this point in time. I am by no means suggesting that regulation doesn't have an impact or regulations are not good. This is not a prescription for deregulation or something. This is about looking back and then saying, where have things worked and where could have things gone better? And we are in a process of setting up pretty much a new regulation. So it is important that we consider all these issues to try and understand where we are in the current space of time. So despite all those changes, all those behavioral changes, imagine how people used to do construction 20, 30 years back to how people are doing construction today. There has been a significant change. If you go to a construction site today to 30 years back, in terms of health and safety perspective, a lot of things have changed. I mean, everybody wears PPE equipment. A lot of people are aware of health and safety risks. They don't take unnecessary risks. There are a lot of guidelines and policies. Contractors take care of their employees. So the cultural change, the behavioral change has had a significant impact in terms of where we are today in construction. Despite all those changes, this is still where we are in terms of the outcomes. So still, that many people die out of health issues every week, and probably roughly that many people die every year because of the safety accidents in construction. So it's quite pertinent to remember that. We have come a long way, but we still have a significant way to move forward. It is good that they're putting a lot of focus on health now compared to safety and weighing them both at equal risk. So hopefully we will start to see a bit more positive change in terms of reducing the fatalities from health. So if you look at the impact of it, the economic cost, everything has an economic cost. The injuries cost about 490 million. Basically, this is the statistic based on 2016-17 survey. And the illnesses cost 571 to the British economy in terms of what's happening in construction alone. This is not a general impact on society or economic cost, but this is just the construction cost. So it's still quite significant. So this almost accounts to 7% of the total across all industries, the impact of health and safety. And if you look at the working days lost because of illness, still roughly about 2.4 million working days between the 3 years from 2015 to 2018, and the injury 0.04 million working days. So a lot of people are calling off sick from work and can't be able to work, and it's causing the impact on economy. It's causing all sorts of other issues, skill shortages and everything else as well. So it has a significant, but when previously I was talking about outcomes, a lot of external significant outcomes impact as well the regulations. And this is one of basically the external influence, because economic cost is not directly related to health and safety of your well-being, but it's more related to the health and safety well-being of this nation and economic cost. So there are all these external factors which influence it as well. So what's happening? I think you would ask a question of, when we looked previously, between 1981 to 1994, when the CDM regs came into place, we went down from 120 casualties, fatalities on site, to about 69. And from 1994 to basically 2019, 25 years, we have reduced it by only half to about, not even half, 38, which is about 30 more basically. So we reduced 40 in that 10 years time, and we reduced 30 in the 25 years time since then basically. So I think the general hypothesis, this applies to pretty much any regulation, this is not just purely with construction, is that it will reach a point where the behavioral change, you can only have so much impact on the behavioral change. So you have this massive drive and push to change your behaviors. There's no behaviors initially before the regulations, and then you have this massive push for behavioral change. That as soon as people change, it will have an impact. I don't think that's correct. It's on some instances, it does have an immediate impact, but often impact can only be measured through time. So the change that happened after 1994 regulation, it has a time lag, and the impact takes a certain amount of time. And the impact has also a certain prescribed level. You can only change things so far. Beyond that, you can't do any more change. And that's when you start to relook at your regulation and say, hang on a minute, why have we stagnated here? Where are consistent problems still within the regulations, and how can we change them to make it more in line with the current outcomes, and how can we reduce outcomes further? So there's always that issue. You have your regulations, you have behavioral changes, then you consider the regulations and do a review of regulations on what are the significant changes and what are the new changes that you would like to have, and then you amend the regulation. So that's what been pretty much happening with CDM regulations basically. So there was regulations and they had a bit of an impact, and then they changed it in 2004, 2007 and 2015 to bring it in line to see where things are not working basically. So that's why regulations always take time, especially particularly the process driven regulations always take that time. So it's basically, so if you want to get the benefit of the regulations, it takes quite significant time. That's the impact. Some of the other factors, if you look at this is the survey we did recently on the CDM, the new current CDM regs, in terms of the behavioral patterns, compliance, basically, that's all it is. We looked at who's complying, who's not complying. These are the duty holders under the regulations. On the left, client, principal designer, principal contractor, and contractors. And if you look at the compliance under the current regulations, clients who are the significant influence still have only very minor compliance. If you look at it, 6% of them are very good compliance. But if you look at the other factor on the right-hand side, poor compliance, 29% and 12% of the clients have either poor compliance or very poor compliance. And a lot of clients still don't know. Another big culprit of it is the principal designer. If you look at the principal designer, again, good compliance, very less, and adequate compliance, most of them do understand a bit, but poor compliance and very poor compliance is still quite significant. And that's the same thing with the designers. So if you look at the top three, they all have influence at the design stage. If you look at construction as pre-construction period and post-construction period, the compliance or understanding of the regulation is still pretty minimum in terms of the pre-construction stages. Now, if you look at the hierarchy of mitigation measures, where you're trying to get rid of the problem at its source in terms of a hazard, that's where it needs to happen. It needs to happen at that pre-construction stage, because once it gets to construction, all you're doing is trying to manage that risk rather than trying to get rid of it in the first place. So that's what they keep saying. You need to design out risk. So that can only happen at that pre-construction stages, and the biggest influencers on that part are the client, the principal designers, and the designers, because they can design out any problems that are already there before they get to construction. Now, if you take the the construction part of it, where the principal contractors and contractors are generally involved, there is a much better understanding of the regulations, particularly with the main contractors or the principal contractors. They're very good with compliance. Most of them have a really good adequate compliance. You still have pockets of low level of compliance, but that's comparably to the top three, it's very minimum. And that goes the same with the contractors as well. When we say contractors here, we're talking about subcontractors. In terms of Grenfell, it could be the cladding contractor, it could be the windows contractor, all the subcontractors that go as a supply chain to the main contractor. So they are the contractors, and they do have a real good understanding of health and safety aspect and CDM regulations and design risk management. So they're doing a reasonably good job. I'm not saying they're doing perfect, but reasonably a pretty good job. So if you look at the problems still are within the top three basically, and that has been pretty consistent right from the beginning of the CDM regs. It hasn't significantly changed. It has changed slightly here and there, but that problem has been consistent. I mean, the principal contractors and contractors had poor compliance in the previous regs, but they have improved dramatically. Their understanding of the regs have improved quite a lot. That means that effectively health and safety in construction on the site has got much better. And when I spoke about the change in construction, the attitudes and the behavioral change in construction, that has had a significant impact on the construction side of the element. There are still a lot of non-compliance when it comes to very small white van man kind of contractors or going around doing work day to day. A lot of pressures of work and a lot of accidents do happen, and major fatalities do often happen in that sphere as well, in the SME sector, because they just don't care about health and safety, or they generally often don't have time to think about it. Often a lot of people do care, but sometimes they don't have time or can afford the time or have the processes to think about health and safety. So a lot can be done on the contractor side of it, but mostly on the SME side of it. So that's where we are with the regulations in terms of compliance. But there are a lot of other external factors as well in terms of how the regulation can have an impact. Skills, I keep going on about skills, but skills is still one of the biggest issue we have in this country. If we have less skills, that means you have the pressures of doing things much more faster with less people at work. So when two people are doing the same work instead of 4 people, they cut corners. Basically, that's what happens to get the outcomes. That means their behavioral patterns changes quite significantly, and that does have a significant impact on the regulations, particularly the health and safety regulations. That means we have to go out. If we are not training our own industry within this country, we might have to go to foreign workers. You have the problem with languages when they come in, understanding the communication issues that causes accidents as well. So there are a lot of behavioral patterns that can drive the accidents, and skills is one of them. We don't have diversity in construction. Often it's all very macho kind of industry to a large extent. If you do something different, you're looked upon sometimes and made fun of. So there's all those patterns which have a really big influence in construction as well. And all of these are external factors which have an influence on the outcome of the regulation. And one of the other big influence is technology as well. For example, when I spoke about innovation-driven regulation and FCA, they have adopted technology basically. Most of their products which they developed to help the regulation were technology-based. Now, if you look at construction on the left-hand side, we're pretty much at the bottom in terms of, this is a McKinsey report in 2018 as to how good we are at adopting technologies or digitizing how good the professions are at digitization. And if you look at construction, we're pretty much 23rd out of all the different sectors that are there. It looks at various different things: asset, usage, labor, digital spending, marketing, business processes, everything. How are we digitizing and how are we using technology to help us? So there's a lot of that. This is going to have this is having a significant influence on the regulation as well. And the enforcement notices by HSE, if you look at that last year in 2017-18, 1742 notices went out and 1273 improvement notices went out. So it's still quite significant notices that gone out in construction. Again, this is a way of enforcement, isn't it? It has that, it's the external influence, and then it has an impact on the regulation. There were about 212 convictions and 17 million total fine in construction, averaging fine of 81,000. So they are quite significant. For those who breach the rules, the fines have been quite significant, and with the new sentencing guidelines, it will only probably go up rather than down in terms of how much you would pay. There's also technologies having quite a bit of influence in terms of how health and safety is managed and how it can assist the regulations. Drones and virtual reality and robotics, all of these are making a massive impact because it is allowing people to do things and putting themselves at less risk. We used to climb ladders and all sorts of things to do inspections. Now you do drone and 3D inspection, and you get a lot more information than you used to get before. Virtual reality, again, Crossrail does everything in a VR cave. They simulate all issues in a safe environment before they go out on site. Robotics is changing quite significantly in terms of lifting. Exoskeletons are becoming quite commonplace in big projects. So there's a lot of things which are helping the regulation as well, and all these will have a significant outcome, but they are still at the lower end rather than the higher end of impact. But they will continue to grow and will start to become a major influence in terms of regulation. So if you look at that's where the CDM regs are. That's where we are over the last 25, 26 years since the regulation came into place. So if you look at the consistent problems from 1994, there has been consistent problems. These are the consistent problems which have not really gone away, and majority of them are still lingering about basically in one way or the other. And one of the major issues is the late appointment of the duty holders, because there's a lot of ambiguity in terms of when someone needs to be appointed, and there are not bigger penalties when somebody is appointed late. So it has happened under 94 regs for planning supervisor. It happened under 2004 and 2007 regs when it became CDM coordinator, and it still happens now under principal designer. The lack of appointment of duty holders always contributes to the problems. The competency framework, again, is a big issue. How do you measure competency of any particular duty holder, whether they're competent enough to do the right job? That is still very ambiguous. There used to be a good ACOP with the 2007 regs, but HSE decided to get rid of that under the new regs under 2015. So there is a lot of gray area around competencies as to what you should be doing. And I think when we looked at some of the key figures, client still don't take the regulations quite seriously. For them, it's another tick box, and as long as they can tick the box, everything is well and fine. So that's still a very big issue in terms of compliance. Rigorous enforcement, again, HSE is strapped out. They don't have enough resources to go out there and do regular inspections and prosecute them if they do it. Probably more will be out in open and more can be changed. And I think one of my biggest gripe is often changes are not really based on reliable indicators. There's no real measurements in place for regulations in this country to say, well, look, we're going to measure the regulation on the outcomes and we're going to set these indicators as outcomes for measurement. We don't do that. We just randomly say in 5 years, we need to pretty much look at the regulations again. For example, under the current regs, it says it needs to go through a review in 2020. Now, I haven't seen the industry looking at having a key indicators and saying, well, look, let's measure these and then see how we do it in the next 2 years. They're just saying, let's run the regulations for 2 years and then see what happens at the end of 2 years. So I think that's my biggest problem, is that there aren't reliable indicators to measure the outcomes of the regulations, whether they're successful or what things are working and what is not. Also, I think in construction, we don't use media and campaign opportunities better. If you look at the regulations in terms of automobile industry and everything, they drive it quite a lot in terms of how media and campaigns are used. They almost do massive television and radio campaigns and all sorts of things. So that's another thing we could be better at it. Now, if you look at this is slightly, I've done the slides just before the consultation document came out, but I think I was pretty much to a certain extent very bang on. If you look at the Hackitt recommendations, they are recommending duty holder roles, but now we know through consultation that duty holder roles are exactly the same apart from the building safety manager. So they pretty much mirror exactly as CDM regs in terms of where we are. This is a like-for-like comparison, apples for apples, between CDM regs and Hackitt review recommendations for new regs. Reliable, safe buildings from outset, serious penalties. Again, they would really pretty much align with CDM regs. It's in the regs, it pretty much says very simply same thing. A clear and identifiable duty holder responsible for building safety of the entire HRRB. The building safety manager, they call it, is pretty much the principal designer under the CDM regs. Basically, he has the responsibility through design stage, through construction stage, to ensure safety is there. Again, notification, they're talking about the JCA Joint Competency Authority. It's basically steps at different period to check that things are done. You have F10 notification regime under CDM regs, where you need to notify the HSE when a project is notifiable, and you need to have certain things in place, pre-construction information pack, health and safety file. All of those things are already there under CDM regs. Again, a regulatory body similar to JCA, HSE, so pretty similar to that. Testing regime with clear labeling and product traceability. Again, it's that the method statements, they say in CDM in construction, if there is a complicated work, you need to produce method statements to ensure that it can be done safely. And then that's exactly what it is, clear labeling and product traceability. So if you look at it, it's pretty similar. There's not really massive difference between the regulations that have been prescribed by Judith Hackitt to the current CDM regs as 2015 regs. So they are pretty identical in terms of their outcomes. Yes, they differ here and there because they're very more fire specific and high-rise buildings, but the ethos or the background of that regulation is pretty similar. So there's not massive difference. So where's the problem then? I think where the problem is that the regulations really, if you look at that hierarchy, elimination, substitution, engineering controls, the hierarchy controls, the entire innovation happens in that elimination point. And if you look at whether the current CDM regs or the Hackitt review recommendations, they are pretty much setting a process in place rather than actually looking at the innovation, getting rid of the problem itself. What they're saying is manage the problem. And I think that's where perhaps there could be lessons learned from CDM regs, because CDM regs followed pretty much a similar process in terms of where they said, let's look at the process, let's try and set process so that things don't happen. Whereas if you look at the financial regulations, they're saying, let's innovate and make sure there is no hazard or risk in the first place at all. And then if there is something, let's set a process for that. So I think it's an opportunity missed, because if we go down the route of similar CDM regs, if you looked at the timeline of where we are in 30 years time, 25 years time, yes, regulation did have an impact, a significant impact of that, but we could have been much more better. And when it comes to fire regs, you only need one of those accidents to happen to have a very significant impact. So there are a lot of other issues like longer time and increased cost, heavily reliant on competency. How do we measure that? Greater influence of external factors as well, skill shortages, all of those things are going to drive what happens with the regulations, and its enforceability as well. Yes, Joint Competency Authority will look at the documents, but how are you going to really enforce it on the ground? Because there aren't that many resources available to enforce it. If a big body like HSE can't enforce it fully 100%, how is a new body going to enforce it? And it also comes down to commitment of resources and priorities when it comes to that enforcement. So I think I can see the standard pitfalls that the CDM regulations suffered from, that the Hackitt review regulations might suffer as well in the long term. But I think we do have a brilliant opportunity through consultation to put forward those views, to look at be a more innovative driven and be a bit more selective how you do the regulations, so that we have better outcomes compared to where we are. So I think those are the fundamental lessons learned. Strengthen the focus of innovation. I think that is fundamental. I think we need to be more innovation driven regulation rather than a process driven. and increase the quality of regulatory framework regarding innovation as well. I think that's, again, goes back to the same point. It needs to be innovation driven. It needs to be that top point. Let's get rid of the problem through innovation rather than try and manage it. If it doesn't happen, then we can manage it. We need to also have reliable indicators. We need to set indicators now while we're writing regulation to say we're going to measure the regulation over the next 4 years over these reliable points and see how it has functioned and where the impact has really been. And I think we need to look at how we do the regulation, what's the frequency of it, how we review it, because I think it matters. We can't just sit around and use a standard rule and then say we'll put a regulatory review in 5 years' time. I think it needs to be a bit more than that, rather than just a single note at the end of the regulation as to when it will be reviewed. I think that's a bit of almost like an afterthought. And I think we can learn from other regulations as well. We need to look wider and beyond rather than just look at construction regulations. There has been a lot of talk about how good CDM regs have been and what impact it has, but not really a lot of talk about what happened in financial authority, what happened in chemical industry, and how they have changed things and how their innovation has driven over there. So all those things, we need to look a bit wider to see where the positive benefits can be had before we undertake this regulation. So I think that those are the key issues which we can learn. And I think if we do implement these, I think there will be a much more positive change, and the time takes to create that change will be much more reduced as well, and some positive behavioral change. So to conclude, just 2 minutes before, I am not here prescribing at any point that it's a case for deregulation. I think safety regulations have made a significant contributions to reducing risk and positive behavioral change in construction. I can talk about construction because that's what I've been dealing with, and that's what I've worked, and that's what I'm passionate about. And they did have a significant, whether it's building regs or health and safety regs or CDM regs, they made a significant contributions. I think from my point of view, Hackitt Review Recommendations in its current form is more a process-driven regulation rather than an innovation-driven regulation. And I would like to see innovation alongside the process rather than just purely process-led. And I think that's where the big change needs to come. And I think we need to really have open mind in construction to explore new ways of delivery, not just look at process, but we can look at technologies, we can look at inventions, we can look at everything else to say, how else can we do things? Behavioral science is such a big aspect of regulation at the moment, and I think it will be good if we can look at how we can change behavioral patterns a bit more differently. So there's a lot of research going on in that side of things as well. So I think we need to be a bit broader in our thinking process to try and see how else can we do regulations and how we can improve them, and so that we have a more positive impact in a much more shorter time. I think that's pretty much it. I think we try to stick to the time, and thank you for listening. And if you have any questions, I think contact me, drop me a line, email, or you can just send me connect me to me on LinkedIn, I think, or my LinkedIn and Twitter is on the front, and just drop me a line. I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about any of the issues I discussed. I know 1 hour is a very short time to look at. It's a very big topic, and hopefully gain some insight as to how the regulation works, where the CDM regulations really made a change, and what could be improved, and how Judith Hackitt Recommendations can learn from that process while implementing new regulation. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Bobby. We hope you enjoyed the webinar today. Unfortunately, no time for questions today, but like Bobby said, if you want to get in touch with him directly, obviously that's available if you have any questions about it. This will be available on YouTube, hopefully by lunchtime, if you'd like anybody else to watch it, and it does count for 1 hour of CPD. Right, excellent. Thanks everyone for attending, and we hope you enjoyed it. Thanks, bye.